Judging as a job. Judges are important actors in our court system. We've seen a lot of judges on television, and the job seems pretty cool. But not all judgeships are alike. The job description varies a great deal depending on what kind of judge you are. So let's start with the trial judges. If you're going to be a judge, chances are you'll start as a trial judge. The trial judge must complete three main types of tasks: adjudication, negotiation, and administration. Adjudication for the trial court judge is not exactly how we'd imagine it would be. Trials in real life are never as cleverly scripted as they are on television. A lot of what the judge has to do is decide on motions. Some of these happen during the proceedings, typically in the form of objection, sustained. But much of this happens outside of the courtroom, as lawyers petition the court for any number of legal rulings in an attempt to further their case. Besides this, the judge has to try to keep control of the courtroom. Any of you old enough to know who Judge Ito is might know what I'm talking about. He was the judge in the first O.J. Simpson trial. You can see him on this cover of Newsweek magazine. He was notoriously outmatched by the lawyers in his courtroom, and he let them run roughshod over him. The other photo here is George Zimmerman's defense team yelling at Judge Deborah Nelson, causing her to walk out of the courtroom in disgust. The second main task is probably one of the things that takes up the most time. That's negotiation. Judges often try to facilitate out-of-court settlements in both civil and criminal trials. In criminal trials, this is called the plea bargain. Despite the fact that our pop culture crime dramas are dominated by trial scenes, the vast majority of criminal cases in the United States never make it to trial. A judge must approve of every one of these plea bargains, and so you can imagine that this takes up a lot of the judge's time. And it's probably not a terribly exciting or rewarding part of the job. Of course, the plea bargaining system is problematic for its own reasons, as you can see in the documentary called The Plea. The next part of the job is the dirty little secret they never tell you about, and that's administration. Judges must organize their schedules, finding a way to deal with all of the cases on their dockets. Because trial courts have mandatory jurisdiction, this means that a lot of fancy footwork needs to be done in order to manage the crushing workload. Also, judges have to manage their budgets and their court staff. These administrative tasks may be shared to one degree or another across judges in the same court, but at least some of this responsibility falls on each judge. Let's take a quick peek into the life of the trial court judge.
All rise.
One of the foundations of our country is our judicial system. Judges and magistrates are charged with making sure this system operates in accord with the law. Most of us think of the judge as the person who keeps order in a courtroom by occasionally banging a gavel.
Quiet in the courtroom.
But judges play a far more important role. In overseeing legal proceedings, they act like referees, ensuring that the rules are followed. They also issue decisions and hand down sentences. Depending on their position, judges and magistrates might specialize in a particular area, such as family, civil, or criminal law. Sometimes called justices of the peace, magistrates can perform wedding ceremonies and handle cases dealing with traffic violations, misdemeanors, small claims cases, and pretrial hearings. They generally have at least a bachelor's degree. Judges are appointed or elected, and almost always have law degrees and experience in the kind of courtroom they will oversee. Without judges and magistrates, we would probably lose one of our most cherished rights, the right to a fair trial.
So, does this job rule? Maybe. There are some good things about it. You do get a certain level of prestige from being a judge. People around town will stop calling you by your first name and start calling you Judge. There's also quite a bit of freedom associated with being a trial court judge. You have a large amount of control over your work schedule, for one thing. And you have power. You are in charge of your court. You get to hold the gavel and bang it when people irritate you. You can also put people in jail for contempt of court. Besides, you get to wear a robe to work, and that's pretty cool. But there are quite a few things that aren't so great about this job. First, law school does not really teach you what you need to know about being a trial court judge. Neither does practicing as a lawyer. New judges have a lot to learn, and the job is quite stressful. Even aside from the stress of being tossed into a job you don't know how to do, there is still the stress of being responsible for decisions that really impact the lives of the litigants in your courtroom. Besides, it's a lot of work. And the job of the trial court judge is a little messy. Unlike appellate court judges, trial court judges have to deal with litigants and jurors. This can make the courtroom quite chaotic. Trial court judges must also learn quickly to be decisive, as most of the decisions of law that they make must be made on the fly. Remember that when an attorney yells out, "Objection!" the judge's response is actually a decision on a matter of law. So the judge replies, "Sustained" or "overruled" without missing a beat. A few other things that aren't so great about being a trial judge. First, many state trial court judges have to face elections. Often, this means that they have to raise campaign money or otherwise subject themselves to the whims of the electorate. We'll talk more about that later. Also, they don't tend to make that much money, at least compared to what they would have earned as a lawyer. Finally, being a trial court judge is not without its dangers. Here's just one example of an incident where judges were injured in the line of duty. I chose this one because this happened at the Tarrant County Courthouse just a couple of years before I went to work there. Trial judges sometimes become targets because someone always leaves the courtroom disappointed. And because the stakes are sometimes very high, people have been known to threaten or actually commit violence against judges. This isn't to say, of course, that being a judge is particularly dangerous. However, it is not without its dangers. Now, let's consider the life of an appellate court judge. Here, we'll be considering intermediate appellate court judges in the federal and state systems. Most state Supreme Court justices probably also fit this category, at least to some degree. This is especially true for state Supreme Court judges who face mandatory dockets and re-election campaigns. First, we'll revisit the main duties of a judge to see how they apply to appellate court judges. In terms of adjudication, the job of an appellate court judge is much different from that of a trial court judge. There are no juries or litigants here, and the judges do not need to make determinations about matters of fact. The courtroom experience is limited to oral arguments, where the lawyers for each side present their best legal arguments to the panel of judges. The judges, of course, can interrupt them whenever they want. Then, the appellate judge gets to leave the courtroom and mull it over for a while. While some appellate courts render some of the easier decisions on the spot, many of the decisions will be talked about at judicial conferences. The judges will then take time to craft opinions to explain the legal and factual basis for their rulings. As for negotiation, there isn't much of this. The most negotiation an appellate court probably has to do is with the other judges on the panel. The judge might try to convince the other judges to join an opinion or to agree on a particular outcome of the case. But the administrative task isn't really that much different from the trial court. They still have to squeeze an outrageous amount of work into a limited docket, and they also have to deal with shrinking budgets. So, does this job rule? I'd say that this job probably rules. There is less contact with litigants and no juries, so the courtroom environment is a lot more predictable and orderly. Appellate judges have even more freedom in terms of their work schedule because so much of the work can be done outside of normal business hours. This job is also a bit more brainy than the job of the trial court judge, as the main output of the court is in the form of carefully crafted legal opinions. There is also more time to think, so the judges usually don't have to make split-second decisions. And they still get the prestige and the power, probably more than their counterparts in the trial courts. Finally, they still get to wear the robe to work. Besides, our new appellate court judges look pretty happy, don't they? But there are still some things about the job that might not be ideal. It's still an awful lot of work, and for only a little bit more money than a trial judge might make. There's also a lot of reading. The appellate court judges need to read the transcripts of the lower court record, and they also have to read and understand the legal briefs submitted by the parties. Again, there is not a lot of training for this in law school, although law schools probably prepare lawyers better for jobs as appellate court judges than as trial court judges. Some of these judges do still need to stand for election occasionally, and that can be a drag. And there is still that element of danger, although it's probably farther removed for the intermediate appellate court judges. Finally, let's talk about the Supreme Court of the United States. I'm not going to talk too much about the job of the Supreme Court Justice right now, because we'll be talking about this over and over for the rest of the semester. The job is similar to the appellate court judge, except that the judges decide which cases to hear. So, does this job rule? Yes. It absolutely rules. Why? The short answer is because when you're a Supreme Court justice, you can pretty much do whatever you want. You can go on Sesame Street, like Justice Sonia Sotomayor did. You can go on cool vacations and ride an elephant with your work buddies. You can even pre-party with a glass of wine and then fall asleep at the State of the Union address. Seriously, you can do whatever you want. And people will still make cool memes about you. You can write books about pretty much whatever you please. Justice Story wrote a book about poetry. In all, he wrote 33 books. Justice William O. Douglas wrote 51 books. Justice O'Connor writes a children's book and a book about growing up on a cattle ranch. Overall, Supreme Court justices have written hundreds of books. These justices also get respect. While it is true that more people can name all three Stooges than can name any three Supreme Court justices, these guys are pretty famous as far as judges go. They have groupies. People line the streets to see them at work. They also wield a considerable amount of power, given that they have a final say on the interpretation of the Constitution. So, are there any drawbacks to being a Supreme Court justice? Not really. And you get to keep this job until you die if you want. Nobody can vote you out of office, and nobody can lower your salary. So being a Supreme Court justice is awesome. Case closed.